Hi, I'm Eric Voss, and this is a breakdown of Rick and Morty Season 3, Episode 5, The Whirly-Durly Conspiracy. Yeah, Rick and Jerry episode! So I'm gonna go a little too deep and point out all the fun details that the writers and animators snuck in here, and let's just jump right into it. Starting with the opening images. So this episode begins with the depressing montage of Jerry in his bachelor pad. And notice how he stares reflectively at this frozen pie as it slowly rotates in the microwave. Now, I'm gonna overanalyze the shit out of this image. Kind of what we do here, deal with it. I think this shot is suggesting that Jerry feels a bit like this pie, just spinning in place and not visibly changing, stuck in a mundane routine cycle that he can't break out of. Now, this episode is titled The Whirly-Durly Conspiracy, referring to the Whirly-Durly roller coaster that Jerry and Rick go on later, and Rick almost gets assassinated on. But the writers said that this entire episode is structured to mirror Jerry and Rick turning on each other to the sudden turns of the Whirly-Durly. And that turning motif starts with this opening image. Jerry is spinning in place until Rick arrives and spins him off the rails. From there, Rick turns Jerry's expectations, confessing that he's taking him out to appease Morty, not because he needed him on an adventure or to, as Jerry expects him to, dump him in space. Later, Jerry turns on Rick, suggesting to go on the Whirly-Durly with him so that his assassins can kill him. But then Rick turns again, agreeing that he was partially responsible for Jerry and Beth's marriage falling apart, and that causes Jerry to turn back, trying to save Rick. Then when Jerry confesses, Rick turns on him again, confessing his true reason for hating him, that he's a predator posing as prey in order to lure in people with his patheticness. And then later, after enjoying Rick's dumb, docile state, Jerry tries to save him by attacking Rosado Groupon. So really, this entire episode is thematically an emotional roller coaster that allows these two competing patriarchs of the Smith household to come to terms with each other. Okay, back in Jerry's bachelor pad, the way Rick bursts in and pulls Jerry out of bed is a direct callback to the very first scene of the first episode of the series. And let's look back at all the other ways this episode calls back past episodes. Okay, so Jerry has this Titanic poster over his bed. That's a nod to the episode Rick's Business, when both he and Beth went on that stupid Titanic experience. Later, when Summer and Beth argue, you can see the interdimensional cable box in the background. Of course, that's from the episode Rick's Minutes. And in the driveway in front of the house, notice the cracks forming the perimeter around the property. This was also visible in past episodes this season. It's also from Rick's Business. Remember when they teleported the house to another dimension and brought it back without Jerry and Beth noticing. Then there's Ethan, Summer's old boyfriend. He shows up this episode. Remember, we saw him in season 1's Anatomy Park. He was angry that Summer wasn't responding to his text, and the character Jacob got him to realize it's because of a traumatic experience.
He made me feel like a girl!
And that whole idea of uncertainty over sexual identity kind of also applies to Jerry this episode. He confesses that he always wanted to know what it felt like to have a vagina, which also might connect to his past struggle over his love for Sleepy Gary in Total Recall. Then there's the mailman from M. Night Shyamalan's.
My man!
He shows up briefly before he gets crushed when Morty turns a mailbox into a giant mailbox. And in the background of the resort bar, there's the alien from the Blips and Chits arcade in Morty Night Run.
This guy's taking Roy off the grid! This guy doesn't have a social security number for Roy!
Now, the main setting of this episode is this super wealthy resort with an immortality field with no death, disease, or dismemberment. And this sounds like it could be influenced by the movie Elysium. That's the Neil Blomkamp movie about the one percenters on the luxurious space station with perfect health. And as always, there were a bunch of other cinematic influences on this episode, so let's go through all these references in a breakdown segment that this channel calls Under the Influence. So also at this resort is a super obese alien stuffing his face. This looks a lot like the character from Monty Python's The Meaning of Life who eats himself to death and explodes. And of course there's the alien with the chin that looks like Jeff Goldblum.
Yo, what's up, Big Chill?
Now Rick is referencing the 80s Goldblum movies The Big Chill and The Fly. And in The Fly, Goldblum went into a telepod and came out on the other side with his DNA having mixed with a fly, turning them into a monster. Now the other storyline this episode follows Summer using Rick's device, the Morphizer XE. This seems like Rick's version of the shrink machine from Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, or to be more specific, the sequel Honey, I Blew Up the Kid. This episode actually ends similar to that movie, with the mother also growing to a gigantic size and calming down the giant angry kid. Here, the writers use this device to literally blow up Summer's body issues. Later in the episode, Beth says this line.
Right before she Clive Barkered herself.
Clive Barker made the movie Hellraiser, which features these bloody, skinless creatures, which are definitely an influence on the giant Inside Out Summer. Now, the Whirly-Durly roller coaster has the same design as the machine from the Jodie Foster movie Contact. In that movie, it opened up a wormhole to the other side of the galaxy. And actually, that trippy journey that she goes on seems to be an influence on the look of Jerry's cosmic trip. Also, the character Risotto Groupon says this about Rick.
My kingdom was usurped by force, with weapons and technology supplied by your father-in-law.
This actually sounds a lot like the origin story of Tony Stark in the first Iron Man. Remember, he was attacked and kidnapped using his own company's weapons. This is actually the second time this season that Rick has been loosely compared to Stark. Remember, the suit up and escape sequence in Pickle Rick was definitely an homage to Iron Man. And then Rick says this line later after he gets tranquilized.
I want cookies and a 90-minute cut of Avatar.
I just love the idea that the dumbest version of Rick is basically Jerry. He loves these overrated James Cameron movies like Avatar or Titanic. He just thinks they're too long. Finally, the design of the smooth leg runner's mouth seems to be influenced on the look of the Predator from the Predator movies and the Demogorgon from Stranger Things. Actually, I like how this creature has this scrotum-like organ that smacks Jerry in his face. The animators of Rick and Morty always sneak in these gross, dumb sexual images. So let's quickly run through a couple of the others in a very mature segment that we're going to call Dick Jokes. So of course, when we see Rick's x-ray showing all of his cybernetic implants, they made sure to include the outline of his balls. And even though this isn't technically a dick joke, as I said, Jerry mentioned this episode that he wanted to know what it was like to have a vagina, and actually right before he confesses this, in the bathroom, the faucets are shaped like vaginas. That is probably why it was on his mind. And of course, there is a ton of sexual imagery during this trippy cosmic apotheosis montage, which begins with Jerry naked and his genitals blurred out. Actually, this whole montage is visually fascinating to look at. It seems like it may be influenced by movies like 2001: A Space Odyssey and the Goodbye Moon Man sequence from Morty Night Run. Also, it reminded me a lot of the interdimensional travel sequence from Doctor Strange, which coincidentally Dan Harmon actually collaborated on. You know, I wish there was a segment where we could like look more closely at all this. Oh wait, there is. Zoom and enhance. Okay, so this is all loaded with spiritual imagery. There are these good and evil figures that look like they were taken out of that existential film, The Seventh Seal. But there are also pagan figures like the Baphomet. That's the figure that has the goat head. It's an occult figure, an object of satanic worship. Behind them is the all-seeing eye, or the Eye of Providence. That's the religious/Freemason symbol. It's on the Great Seal of the United States, pictured on the back of the $1 bill. A lot of conspiracy theorists have also linked it with the Illuminati, which could be connected to all the triangles that also appear during the sequence. Really, I don't know what they're talking about. There are also these really creepy images of Jerry as a gazelle and Rick as a lion hunting him, intercut with this snuff film footage on projector celluloid of Rick and Jerry doing some really inappropriate stuff. Finally, the three of them here are lying on a giant triskelion symbol, which has a ton of meanings in different cultures, but it's associated with the Holy Trinity in the British Isles. Now, by the way, the game Pocket Mortys has been updated to include a lot of these characters in this episode, including spiritual leader Rick, Victorian Jerry, Victorian Rick, Risotto Groupon, Inside Out Beth, Inside Out Summer, Shinoopy Bloopers, and Master Morty. Okay, real quick, I'm gonna run through a few other interesting things that I noticed in this episode. The darkest moment was when the immortality field drops and this alien kid accidentally kills his sister. And yeah, this is really messed up, but it actually connects to a theme of this whole series introduced back in the first episode. Violence is real. Remember, Rick handed Morty that gun to shoot at the Gronflamites, telling them that they weren't real, and then Morty shot one and he bled to death. So the deaths that we see on the show are all horrifying and tragic, so I'm glad they keep up with this consistently. Also, there's a detail of Beth making art out of horse hooves, and I like how this is an example of Beth's arc throughout this episode. Notice how later Rick says this about her.
Who do you think had more taken from them when you shot 20 cc's of liquid dream killer into my daughter? She was Rick's daughter, Jerry. She had options.
Oof.
So Rick is pointing out how Beth's career as a horse surgeon was connected to her settling for Jerry, limiting herself from a more creative life. And now we see Beth using materials from her day job to do something more creative. So as we saw in Pickle Rick, Beth was starting to act more like her father, which is something Morty straight up calls out this episode. This hoof art is another form of Beth trying to make something more interesting and kind of creepy out of her everyday life, just like her father would. And real quick, I like how when Rick uses his cybernetic parts against Risotto Groupon, this massive weapon just takes the form of a little suction cup thing. This actually kind of reminds me of when Rick used this snake up the leg trick and Get Swifty. Also, notice how when Rick's left eye is covered, it screws with his depth perception, so he struggles to grab the gun. And that brings us to the post-credit scene with these three little guys from the Morphizer customer support, which is one of my favorite jokes Christmas episode? Now, if you look closely, the graffiti on the walls behind them shows the words like tits and pansy and chili dog, but there's also another all-seeing eye. Really, I don't get what the fuss is about this, Hail Hydra. They also point out a horribly mutated Ethan, who Morty presumably used the morphizer on earlier. Now, it's interesting to see Morty become such a no-nonsense badass this season. In fact, this could be the start of his transformation into evil Morty, if you believe in that theory that all of the events that we're seeing over this series are actually leading up to that moment in the season 1 finale where evil Morty was introduced. Also, another question about this: what does this mean for the new anatomy park that Rick built inside Ethan's body? Did it get destroyed with all these mutations? Remember, this might not be the exact same Ethan. That Ethan was presumably Cronenberg back in that C-137 dimension. So, unless the Rick of this universe also had built an anatomy park inside this Ethan, the park was probably long gone anyway. Do you think Jerry can ever win over Rick and win back his family? And is Morty now the most mature character on this show? Keep this conversation going in the comments below. You can tweet me your thoughts at EAVoss or to New Rockstars at New Rockstars. Share this video and subscribe to our channel for more Rick and Morty content. And if you are a big fan of us, you can contribute to us on Patreon. Big thanks to all of our current donors, especially Matthew Salvas. All right, thanks for watching. See you next week. Bye.